Hello, this is the second part of my video on the ideas of the Marquis de Condorcet regarding the rights of women. For Condorcet, education was of crucial importance, not just in achieving equal rights for women, but in righting many of the injustices of the present social system. Education would counter most of the limitations generally attributed to women. If, as his opponents argued, women were presently limited in their abilities, it was because of their poor education and the difficult circumstances under which many had to live. Women were not intellectually inferior to men, but rather the victims of an inferior education. It was argued by the opponents of women's rights that women reasoned differently or not at all. The reality was that such differences as occurred were the result of a lack of education. If, as was widely believed, women were ignorant and superstitious, it was because of their upbringing. If they were more gentle and sensitive than men, it was because of their socialization and overprotected lives. If they were vainly concerned with their facial charms, that was because that helped them in a society in which such appearances were advantageous. Social realities both limited the efforts of women in general and encouraged ambitious women to subterfuge. Those women who aspired to exercise real political power were blocked from exercising it openly, and so resorted to illicit influence. Indeed, this was a characteristic of the old French regime, where influence both by women and by other courtiers was exercised in secret. In new revolutionary France, the situation should be different. The exercise of power should be in public, so that all ideas could be subject to debate. The subordination of women was paralleled by the subordination of male laborers. Any man who was forced to constantly work, and so lacked opportunity to educate his reason, was in the same condition as women. Did this mean that only those men who were trained as lawyers should be citizens? Such exclusions were the same as those which underlaid aristocracies. Condorcet regarded the sexes as different from each other on account of women's reproductive and maternal role, and believed that even in a more rationally ordered society these differences would continue to have social effects, but he was unequivocal in his demands for equality. The specific policies which Condorcet advocated included the following. Girls should be educated alongside boys, in universal coeducational schools, a remarkable view at the time, and a woman who showed talent should be able to enter any profession. Again, even before the Revolution, Condorcet had opposed laws specifically excluding women from particular occupations, including the military and the magistrates. Legislators should also be aware of the social limitations which held back women. Thus, women generally lacked experience of business or government, and were so condemned to occupy a subordinate social role. As the father of a daughter, he also wrote of the necessity for women to prepare themselves vocationally for their own independence. If a woman were to lose both parents, then her guardians should ensure that she learnt the skills that could earn her a living. Concerning marriage and the family, Condorcet was particularly revolutionary. It has been said that Condorcet may have been the only philosophe who never kept a mistress, and was instead happily and faithfully married, but he was also the one most opposed to the 18th century family. Thus, he advocated making marriage a civil rather than a religious contract, and opposed the despotic role of parents in arranging their children's marriages. He also believed that women should be able to plan their own pregnancies. He saw the inability to divorce as the seedbed for such evils as adultery, prostitution, and bastardy. So, in the Esquisse, he wished to permit divorce, and hoped that more loving and egalitarian unions, such as his own, would follow, if women were given more independence, and were able to enter voluntarily into reciprocal unions. Again, Condorcet said that if marriage was a society of only two people, then the only inequality between them should be if there needed to be a casting vote on some decision. That would be very rare, and only in face of some urgent pressure, and even that could alternate or be divided between the partners by particular matters of concern. Otherwise, husband and wife should come to an agreement on all decisions. As with so many of the reformist beliefs that Condorcet espoused, neither the passion nor the reasoning of his advocacy brought the outcomes he desired. This was most evident with his 1790 essay on the admission of women to the rights of citizenship. It was written at a time when Condorcet was a major public figure, and it has been described as one of the most concise and potent defenses of women's rights in the history of feminist thought. It was widely opposed by France's new revolutionary politicians, however, and its proposals ignored or rejected. Condorcet believed that men should support equal rights for women, but it was clear that most of them didn't. Rousseau, it will be remembered, had stated that women should only receive a limited education and remain within the domestic sphere as wives and mothers. They were made only to look after men, and should accept their subordination, even accepting injustice. Again, in the Encyclopédie, Diderot saw the masculine word citizen as only fully applying to men who had political rights. Women, young children, and servants didn't, but were instead represented by the family head. Women had no independent legal rights. They were daughters or wives. Although he had protested against some of the laws which discriminated against women, Diderot also made sure to arrange a good marriage for his daughter while she was still a child, and advised her to honor and obey her husband, as she had hitherto obeyed her father. The majority of educated men at the time had similar views. Women were held to have distinctive natures that suited them to domestic duties. They were unqualified to enter public affairs, because they were more susceptible to sensations than to reason, having a flawed rationality and a weaker sense of justice than did men. Indeed, during the Revolution, publicly expressed opinion was increasingly negative towards those women who were too public and not modest and domestic in their behavior and demeanor. Moreover, many men who had previously favored equality for women began to withdraw their support in the face of women's involvement in revolutionary activities. Finally, the Jacobin-dominated debate on the new constitution in 1793 led to the explicit denial of the franchise to women. Condorcet, by now an increasingly marginal political figure, could do nothing and was silent. Condorcet had already expressed his disapproval of the stands taken by the majority of the male proponents of the revolution. For him, those who declared rights to be universal and inalienable, but at the same time introduced sex as a constitutional condition for political rights, were hypocrites. Such basic human rights were universal and applied to women as much as to men. The legislators might regard themselves as enlightened and speak enthusiastically for the rights of men, but they didn't see the contradiction in making that demand, whilst at the same time denying equality to women, who together with girls constituted half the human race. The fact that enlightened male legislators didn't even notice these violations was the strongest evidence for their being subject to the power of habit rather than thinking for themselves. Aware of the depth of the prejudice he was attacking, he asked his opponents to prove him wrong with evidence rather than ridicule or abuse. He even tried to reassure men that giving women equal rights would not threaten men's political power, making what we would now see as the extremely lame argument that even if given equality, women would be so busy looking after their children that they would be unlikely to have time to be elected to government. At the same time, however, he explicitly linked women's rights to those of religious and racial minorities, as well as to exploited workers in trade and industry. Those who said that women would abandon their domestic duties if given equality, or would actually seize power for themselves, were making the same tyrannical arguments which had been used in enslaving Africans, in censoring the press, and arbitrarily imprisoning innocents in the Bastille. Ultimately, for Condorcet, the total elimination of all those prejudices that had led to gender equality would be among the causes of the progress of the human mind, vital to the general happiness of the whole human race. The inequality of women was fatal to even the party it favoured, because tyranny disfigured the tyrant as much as his victims. Men would be better off after they had accepted the full equality of women. Perhaps I should add that French women only gained the vote in 1944. That is over 150 years after Condorcet had made his eloquent pleas in favour of women's rights. Thank you for listening.